Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates on your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Coyle. In today's episode, I welcome my friend Steve Maggi from the SMA Law Firm to speak about immigration law and the immigration process. Steve himself immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 5 from Argentina, so he approaches this from an interesting perspective. We don't often think of immigration through the lens of economic prosperity for everyone, or growth, or entrepreneurialism. Instead, I think we've been forced into a narrow perspective that today's media wants to see immigration as only those seeking asylum from our southern borders, or worse, through the ugly term of illegal immigration. Steve sheds some beautiful light and stories on how immigration can truly be a win-win for everyone. We talk about the challenges to immigration posed by the prior administration, as well as COVID and how that impacts the flow of people, businesses, and money into the U.S. economy. Steve makes it clear that immigration of entrepreneurs creates thousands upon thousands of jobs for Americans and billions of dollars invested in new and growing businesses that only help grow the U.S. economy. My two takeaways from my conversation with Steve is that he has a broad and deep expertise in the field of immigration law, but he's also got passion and empathy to get foreign entrepreneurs into the U.S. to build a business and a life here. As always, thanks for listening to the podcast. I hope you're subscribed, and if you haven't already, please rate this show so others can find it on their favorite platforms. Lastly, if you have an interesting story and would like to tell it on this podcast, let me know. Drop me an email and let's chat. My email will appear in the show notes below. Thanks. Now, on to the show. Hey everyone, I'm Gordon Coyle, host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Today I have with me Steve Maggi, who's an immigration attorney. And we're going to talk about immigration, broadly speaking. But to start off, I'd like Steve to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about him and his practice. Steve?
Thank you, Gordon. Great to be with you. Where do I start? I guess I start from my beginnings, which is I'm an immigrant myself. I came to the U.S. when I was 5, and I had to go through a very long immigration process to become a U.S. citizen for various reasons. And that's what gave me the push to represent others who are similarly situated, who are entrepreneurs, who understand what the American dream is and want to make the most of their opportunities here. And that's the people that I work with. So for 18 years now, I've had my own immigration firm called SMA Law Firm. And I've practiced in Argentina, New York, and now I have a Florida office as well. So just fighting the good fight, helping entrepreneurs and businesses. And really a lot of them, the goal is for them to set up their businesses that create American jobs. So it's a win-win for everybody.
So that's a good starting point. Let's talk about immigration from a business perspective. Are your clients people coming in from overseas that are looking to either, it's very common for folks to be working in the tech space, for example, or are your clients coming to America to become entrepreneurs? Tell us about that.
So it's a good mix. I've got clients who are strictly investors that are investing passively or actively in businesses that allow them to get a visa or a green card. I have hands-on entrepreneurs who have existing businesses that either they want to expand to the U.S. or they have a track record of setting up businesses and selling them and using an exit strategy, and now they want to invest in something new. And then I have existing companies, multinationals that are expanding to the U.S. I also do visas for companies that are sponsoring foreign nationals that are already in the U.S. And I do family work, but my focus is entrepreneurial. And so runs the gamut, really. You have people also who invest in franchises who don't know anything about running a business and can designate a general manager or somebody to run it for them. So you're talking about people from 70, 80 different countries, and anything from a small startup to a big business that's expanding into the U.S.
do you see any predominance from, any area of the world where people are coming from to the US in the entrepreneurial space?
I think there's a wide variety of nationalities that are represented. There are certain countries that have a historical track record of being big investors in the US, like Japan, Germany, the Netherlands. So obviously I work with individuals from those countries. A lot of it is really determined by whether your country of your nationality has a treaty with the US that allows you to get an investment-based visa. It's called an E2. There are 81 countries that have it. So a lot of the countries like Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, and South Africa, which are the BRICS countries, which comprise half of the world's population, don't have that treaty. And so we have to come up with other ways to help them launch operations here. And a lot of times that's through an existing business they have overseas. So it's not a plug and play thing at all. It's really case by case, depending on the size and scope of what they want to do, the amount they have to invest, and what passports they have will determine which paths they take. So it's coming in from everywhere. The challenge really has been, because of COVID, the shutdown of the embassies and consulates where a lot of these visas are processed, the slowdown and the backlogs caused in terms of visa processing has really put a real strain on the flow of business. And we're talking about billions of dollars that are being invested in the US each year that are allowing people to get visas. And when they get those visas, they're not taking American jobs away, they're creating jobs. I think if you looked at all my clients over 20 years, you'd see that thousands of American jobs were created through the businesses that they set up in the US. So it's coming from everywhere. A lot of it is determined by what country or what nationality those people or those businesses are from.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really interesting point that you just made, that foreigners, and there's always been this, not always, but let's not get too political, but in recent years, there's been a real pushback on, quote, foreigners coming into this country, taking American jobs, stealing American capital, whatever the kind of
right
bad side of things are. But really the reverse of that is true. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Like, how does foreign investment come in, and how does it grow here?
So the investment-based visas are not something that are publicized or talked about much in the media. I work a lot with the media. I do TV interviews, and the focus is always on visas like the H-1B, which are visas for professionals, because there have been documented cases like Disney, for example, where they clearly could show that they were undercutting the market by bringing in foreign nationals, paying them at a lower level wage, and then letting some of their American employees go so they could, drop that bottom line down. Certainly there are employers that do take advantage of the system, and that needs to be overhauled. And that's a whole other discussion about changing the immigration system. But these visas are outside in. It's what I call outside in immigration. It's all a plus. None of them are taking jobs because they're setting up US companies, and maybe they'll transfer one person to the US, but then after that, they are creating jobs. And the only way you can get these visas approved is if you show that you have the capital and a plan in place for projected hiring. And that could be 5, 7, 8 visas over the course of 5 years that are not visas, sorry, but positions for Americans. So the plus minus is clearly in the plus when you hire 7 people, but you only bring in one person, and that person's not replacing anyone. They're coming just to run a new US operation. And so it's all a win-win. The problem is that's not something that people will debate, and that's not something that people can get upset about. And so it's not in the media, right? But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs per year that are created by these outside sources, which are the foreign nationals with capital or with ideas or with existing business platforms.
So they're bringing fresh capital, deploying it here in the US, hiring US workers, helping the US economy grow. Like you said, it's a win-win-win.
Absolutely. So those haven't come under attack as much as what's happening locally with US employers hiring foreign nationals instead of American workers. That's a totally separate thing, and it's really case by case. Obviously, I don't work with those kinds of employers, but I know they're out there. Mm-hmm. And that's what sells newspapers. That's what gets people to click and read articles and look at advertisements. And so that's why it's so popular, especially when President Trump was running for office before he became president. He was talking about that all the time, right? But in reality, that's a very small percentage of jobs that may be shifted compared to the ones that are created with the kinds of visas that I focus on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the way you said it. If it doesn't aggravate people, it doesn't get attention. It's so
I,
true.
I was a journalist first, and I worked at CNN, and the producer once said, "Good news is no news." So unfortunately, that's a pervasive way of thinking, and that is really true. People don't want to read the good news; they want to read, things that they can complain about. So
Yeah,
especially New Yorkers, right? So.
exactly, exactly. Um, Let me ask you, how do these folks from, the BRIC countries all over the world, how do they find you?
Luckily we're living in a virtual universe here, and I'm able to promote what I do through the website, through YouTube, through the interviews that I do with the media, LinkedIn. I mean, I don't think that it would have been really a possibility 20 years ago like it is now. And if you're somebody that's translatable in terms of your ability to speak and your comfort in front of a camera and being able to communicate effectively, I think that's a universal thing. As long as they have some base of English, obviously, or Spanish in my case, because I'm fluent, I'm from Argentina. But I think that it's really leveraging all the tools that are out there that are virtual now in terms of marketing and everything. And then, of course, I met you a decade ago, and you build a network in a specific place, even the most daunting and intimidating city in America, to try to launch an immigration practice, which is New York, because it has more immigration lawyers than anywhere. Eventually you earn that reputation and that translates. But the most important thing to exponentially market has been Zoom, has been YouTube, and all those tools that are out there online that I've been able to leverage.
Yeah, it's interesting, and things like even this, like a podcast where you have your voice heard by people who may not otherwise hear it, and getting the word out. It is interesting that 10 years ago we didn't have tools like we have today. It's interesting though how many of our peer group really don't harness the power of these tools, and they think it's for another generation or something like that.
Yeah, agreed. And I've always been one to sort of ride the crest of these things. And I think that as long as other immigration lawyers don't want to do it, that's fine with me, because then they won't reach those potential clients. But because most of my clients are outside the US and I'm trying to bring them in, this is the most important tool that I have. I used to do presentations overseas 3 times a year, and I would talk to maybe 30, 40 people at a time. This allows me to speak to thousands of people anytime, 24 hours a day. So
Yeah, every day, any day they want to consume your content, they'll find it. So
exactly.
that's a very interesting story. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So we talked about entrepreneurial immigration. Tell us about the other areas of immigration that you do work in.
Well, I do all things immigration that are considered transactional, meaning that you present petitions either electronically or that you print and you mail them. So one component of that is petitions filed with immigration service in the United States. There are a lot of work visas, for example, where a company is sponsoring someone that require that you submit a case in the US. And then eventually, if that person is outside the US, they will have to go for a visa based on the approval. So I do a lot of what they call intra-company transfers. I love to work with artists and people of extraordinary ability. That's called the O1. My parents were artists, so I have a soft spot for people that are creatives, and they need a voice because they're often lost in translation here. It's not just about professionals or accountants or business people. It's about anyone who adds something to this cultural fabric that we have in the US, which makes it such an incredible place, right? And being able to work with those. So I do a diversity. I've essentially done every visa that exists from A to U. And I love to work on those different things because you're working with different skill sets, different verticals, different kinds of people. I've represented people from about 80 countries. So you're talking about a diversity of culture as well. And a lot of that has to do with interfacing with US employers if they are interested in hiring someone and finding the right fit in terms of the visas that are out there. Because some people have visas, like Australians have their own visa if they have a degree, or Canadians and Mexicans have their own visa. So you really have to know the ins and outs of what visas are available depending on nationality, what degrees they have, what their skill sets are, and if it has to do with extraordinary ability, how much recognition they have in the field. And the most rewarding thing is when you look at a case for extraordinary ability and you go through a roadmap with the client and you tell them, you know what, if you add this category by doing X, Y, and Z, then you qualify. And when they take that extra time to do it, and then you submit it and it gets approved, it's really life-changing for a lot of these individuals who dream of working here And eventually, maybe even we can do a self-sponsored green card, which allows them to be here and not be dependent on an employer, but just make their own future. So it's very empowering to work with individuals from all different walks of life and companies that need to fill different positions.
Yeah, it sounds very, very rewarding, very interesting as well. Can you give us a little info or insight into what you've seen with the change of the administrations with regard to immigration? Has it become a little easier? What's the posture look like today versus a year ago?
Okay, so now we're, summer 2021. Since the Biden administration has taken over, there have not been any changes. In fact, it's been sort of a holding pattern. There are a few things that maybe were ratcheted back through what are called executive actions of different kinds. Like there's presidential proclamations, there's executive orders, executive memorandum, but they all have the same effect, which is the executive branch can change the way the law is applied with a stroke of the pen. And that's just signing a document. President Trump changed the way the law was applied in 400 different ways, just talking about immigration through executive actions. And President Biden has tried to ratchet some of those things back. The problem is there's no comprehensive immigration reform, and there hasn't been since 1986. And what we really need here, especially with the internal issues that we have, and I'm referring to the dreamers of the DACA crowd, which is 1.2 million people, and then the people who are here on temporary protected status, and then all the undocumented people, which are looking, we're looking at 15 million people maybe. There's no solution for them, and we need to find one. So that's the one side that has not changed. And unfortunately, what can happen is even if there's an executive order in place, which changes the way the law is applied, if a federal court judge finds that there's something wrong with the way that executive order was signed, or there's something on its face, it doesn't work legally, then a program can be shut down, like DACA was just shut down. And this is a roller coaster and sort of this hamster in the wheel thing that keeps happening. The beauty of our system, political system, is this checks and balances and separation of powers, but it's so extreme. And this is a whole other conversation, right? Political. You didn't want to get political, but there's so many checks that there's really not any progress. And so we're dependent on Congress to try to sort of backdoor these changes through this budgetary backdoor. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but we're all on pins and needles to see what will happen to make some of these changes. And so I think that it's constantly changing. And in fact, in my opinion, way too much, Gordon, because the first 12 years out of 18 that I was doing this, it was pretty consistent. The way the law was applied was consistent. And then we had the presidents trying to change things through executive action. It became literally every few weeks, there was a change. And it's exhausting. And if you add to that COVID, where the embassies and consulates are essentially shut down or almost shut down, and each one is different in terms of how effective or how open it is, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of cases that are stuck overseas, and that really interrupts the flow of business and family members and all these things that would be, if it's normalized. I think I've probably aged 5 years during COVID because of all these things. And so it's changing way too much. And so I hope if we have this conversation again in a year that I can say, everything is back to normal.
So just focusing on the DACA crowd of folks, that's got to be terribly emotionally upsetting just to not know what your future looks like. I don't know if you work with anybody in that area, but how do you counsel them to, hold on, have hope, persist at what you're doing?
I mean, I get this question all the time, and I take it very personally because I came here when I was 5. My mom brought me here. I had no say in the matter. And so I'm a dreamer as well. I just happened to have the good fortune that my mom was a citizen and eventually could get me my own citizenship. But all these other dreamers, and in case the viewers don't know what DACA is, it's called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's a program that was created by President Obama just to give these kids like me who came in under the age of 16 an opportunity to eventually be part of society. And it only gives them an opportunity to work and a protection from deportation unless they commit some sort of crime, which obviously then they would be deportable, and that makes sense. So it's it's one of the most humane acts that was put before Congress. But because Congress didn't pass any law, they had to do it through executive action. And so the message for them is always to be hopeful, but it's very disconcerting because as soon as the program was reinstituted by President Biden, then a federal judge 6 months later struck it down, and now you can't apply again. And so we're talking about almost 1 million people that are in sort of this gray area that don't have any status. They deserve it. I mean, they're hardworking. You have to have a high school diploma or be enrolled in the military or be in college. They want to be productive members of society. They're people that we would be proud to have as our children. And so my message to them is to hold, and we're hoping that there's going to be some congressional action that allows them to be finally on a path to become full residents of this country. And the country will be better for it. But for now, we just have to cross our fingers again.
Yeah, that law is about 10 years old, correct?
Yeah, 2012. So
2012. So we're coming up on 10 years.
Mhm.
These folks have been kind of sitting in a state of limbo for that long period of time. And something that you just mentioned is kind of like startling. Some of these folks are in the military, but they still risk being deported at some point if this law doesn't get figured out and passed, correct?
That's absolutely right. It's
Yeah.
absolutely great. Like the government is happy to take anybody on into the military, but it doesn't guarantee their future either. And they're putting their lives on the line. So obviously there should be some additional benefit to them for doing so.
Yeah. It sounds unbelievable when you think about what America stands for, but
Essentially, what it represents to me is that they identify as Americans. A lot of them don't know what their life was like when they were a small child in another country. They don't identify in any way except maybe their parents, but they really are American first.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of Americans who probably take that for granted, so that they're more proud of being potentially American. And you see that at the ceremonies. If you've ever been to a swearing-in ceremony for citizenship, it's the most beautiful thing ever because you have people from all over the world, especially in New York, and everybody, it's the happiest day of their lives because they are now Americans. And that's how you want everyone to feel when they become a US citizen. And the dreamers are those people as well.
Yeah. And like you said, I think so many people take it for granted, not intentionally, it's just subconsciously we take being an American, as just that's the way we were born, that's how we got here, that's what we are, but it's got to be an emotional thing to watch these people, become Americans. And it would be fascinating to be in that room watching that whole process take place.
Yeah, I mean, I was there myself when I was 14 and I became a citizen, and I've been there for some of my clients, and it's really the most beautiful thing. It reinforces why I do what I do. I'm really proud of all. I mean, these are hardworking people that will not take it for granted even for a day. And that's the kind of people you want living in your country, right?
That's for sure. Yep. So kind of shifting over to some challenges. What are some of the big challenges you face in your practice on a regular basis?
Well, the first challenge I would say that's really reared its head with the first Trump administration was the way that the law was, I guess you could say, manipulated in a way where the goal was no longer to give people the benefit of the doubt in their petitions, but to actually look for excuses to deny. So the denial rates under President Trump compared to President Obama were 4 times approximately what they were under President Obama. And that meant that there were a lot of arbitrary denials. And that was the biggest challenge for me, because how do you convince someone whose goal is to deny that they should actually approve? And so I had to go through a lot of cases where a lot of lawyers were getting cases denied, and then I became the fixer, and I was called in to try to resuscitate cases. And that's very difficult to do because you have to convince the supervisor of the person who denied it that the person actually misapplied the law. It's very nuanced and it's very difficult. And that definitely got me a lot of gray hairs. What you want, and when you come from a country like I did, Argentina, in my case, where the law is civil code and it's supposed to be exactly black and white, but there's a lot of corruption and it's not applied equally. You look to America as a beacon of transparency, right, and clarity. And under the Trump administration, that was not the case. They were clearly trying to deny cases, inventing standards that didn't exist, sending requests for evidence that were citing things that were not correct. And that was obviously with the clear intent to deny cases. And to me, that was an awful time to go through. And so now with this new administration, we haven't seen any changes yet, but I'm hoping that they will catch wind of that, and they'll realize that it needs to be applied fairly. So that was the biggest challenge of my life, was to go through those 4 years to try to fight for my clients when I knew that on the face of the cases, they should have been approved. And I don't submit cases unless I know I can convince someone that they should be approved. And then they might not have been. And then throw the monkey wrench in, which I already mentioned, which was COVID. And that gave the president the ability to do travel bans on Muslim countries, travel direct entry bans on 36 countries now, things that are very arbitrary. Like, why would you bar entry from Holland but not bar entry from Malaysia? I mean, to me, it didn't make any sense. And it was very politically driven. But that's what I'm still dealing with today, is a lot of clients that are stuck overseas, they can't get visas. It's a challenge that I never would have comprehended or anticipated, and that's because of the pandemic. But I also think the government could have been a lot more efficient. They could have switched to electronic virtual interviews as opposed to in person. They could have definitely found a way to keep the ball rolling and to be efficient and to let the people in that deserve to be here in the US. And so that challenge I'm living today, and there's no end in sight to this in terms of when things are actually going to be restored back to normal.
Yeah, and that's the sad part of this story is that for your business and for every business, immigration, non-immigration, all the issues, there's this uncertainty of the future that the pandemic and the kind of resurgence of the pandemic is bringing to light. I think psychologically for a lot of people, we thought we had it behind us.
Yes.
So kind of like going forward with the Delta variant and whatever else may come down the pike, we almost don't want to accept it as real, I think. A lot of people are just like, it's not happening, everything is good. They put their head in the sand, but it's still providing challenges for all of us.
I'm lucky because it's helped in a way for me, because I do a lot of consular work, because I worked overseas for 8 years and I work with the embassies and consulates. A lot of people are coming to me to help solve their issues at the embassies. And so that's been good for my practice. But I would really prefer that it went back to normal and it was transparent, and I could not have the stress of 24 hours a day knowing that my clients might be stuck somewhere. So it's been a plus in some ways, because I've been able to help people that otherwise wouldn't have needed my help. Mm-hmm. But I would prefer normalcy for my own mental health as well as for that of my clients.
I think we'd all agree with you on that one. Yeah. So let's flip the coin. We talked about challenges. Tell us like a great success story that you've had.
Well, I just got an invitation to a wedding, and normally that would be a wonderful thing, but it came from a client who's now become a friend. And the reason why is because he said to me, and he said that when he gets married, he's going to have me stand up in front of everyone and say, if it wasn't for Steve Maggi, I would not be getting married and I would not be in the United States. And that's because he was a Danish entrepreneur who set up a US business. He was given the wrong advice. He wanted to come and run the US entity to expand the business, which would create jobs. He was given the wrong advice by an attorney who put him into the wrong visa category. It got denied. They tried to appeal it. They lost a year. In the meantime, he's paying the rent on the office. He's got all these expenses. He tried to reapply for what's called ESTA, which is for people from 39 countries who don't need a visa. They just apply if they're from a certain country. But he got denied the ESTA because he had been denied a visa. And so automatically was rejected. And he could not enter the United States. So the company's bleeding money. He can't enter the United States to fix anything or even shut it down. And he's got all his backing and his venture capitalists and his partners that are depending on him. He calls the Danish consulate in New York, says, do you have anybody you can recommend? They recommend me. He gives me the hypothetical. He says, this is a hypothetical. He didn't tell me that it really happened. Which visa would you go for? And I said, oh, it's clearly an E2. You don't qualify for L1, which is the one that the other attorney recommended. 18 days later, we submitted the case. I worked on it all night, all day with him. And 3 weeks later, or 4 weeks later, he had an interview, got his 2-year E2 visa to come into the US. Now the company has 18 employees, I think, and they've been offered millions of dollars potentially as a buyout to sell the company in 4 years' time.
Wow.
And he also met his wife at an event that I invited him to, which was a pitch night for Scandinavian companies. They met there, and now they're getting married. So we're going to get him his green card. But literally, if I hadn't rescued that situation, found the right fit, gotten him the visa, these jobs wouldn't have been created, and he wouldn't be getting married and making the rest of his life here in the US. So that's the ultimate dream, is to not only help a business grow and to create jobs, but also to help the personal lives of the people that I work with.
That is an amazing success story. In fact, I'll tell you, listeners, this is not scripted. We didn't have this on the books. I just asked Steve the question and it came up. I mean, that is like an amazing success story, and that's got to be tremendously rewarding. I'm sitting here like, wow, that is so fantastic. That's really great, Steve. And
Yeah,
it's really a testament to the work you do. I just think that's fantastic. And there's probably dozens of other stories like that you have, I'm sure.
I have some really good ones, but that's the best one, because we're friends and now I'm going to be at his wedding. And I mean, that doesn't happen every day,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's great. Steve, I want to be respectful of your time. We're kind of running up around a half an hour in this conversation. I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you would want to add in before we start to wrap up?
Just that, this is a very complicated field, immigration law, but that doesn't mean that there's not hope. And if someone needs a solution, you need to work with somebody that has a well-rounded expertise, and that includes working within the US as well as with all the embassies and consulates and everything. It's a three-dimensional thing. It's a battle that's fought on several fronts to get where you want to go. But there are people out there, maybe not a lot of us, but there are some people out there that are not only knowledgeable enough to maneuver it and to handle it, but are passionate enough and empathetic, which is very important in this field in order to get you to the US if that's really what you want.
And one of the most important questions is, if somebody who's listening or watching this conversation, they wanted to reach out and get in touch with you, how's the best way to do that?
I think email's the best, and my email is smaggi@smalawyers.com with an S, or they can go on the website, which is smaimmigration.com.
Great. I'll also post those two bits in the show notes and in the description on the YouTube video that we'll have for this interview. Steve, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Great stories, as always. My name is Gordon Coyle. I'm the host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. If you have an interesting story that you'd like to share with our audience, give me a call or drop me an email. I'll have that in the show notes as well. And we'll talk to you soon. So until next time, I'm Gordon Coyle. Steve Maggi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Gordon. A pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.